Good morning and welcome to the NTC information session on the Heavy Vehicle National Law Consultation Regulatory Impact Statement. My name is Michelle and I'll be your webinar moderator. Our presenter today is Don Hogben. Don joined the NTC in late 2022 as Principal Consultant to lead the NTC's Heavy Vehicle National Law Reform Program. Prior to joining the NTC, Don was the Chief Regulatory Policy and Standards Officer at the NHVR and has also held senior regulatory, policy and planning positions in the SA Department of Planning, Transport and Infrastructure and Vic Roads. Don has been involved in freight transport policy and national reform programs since 2000, including the development of the HVNL and the establishment of the NHVR. Like always, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question, please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen during the session. Your questions will be answered at the end of the session. Today's webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the NatRoad website and YouTube channel. So welcome, Don. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Michelle, and good morning, everyone. Before I get started, I'd just like to acknowledge country. The National Transport Commission acknowledges the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and celebrate their enduring connection to country, knowledge and stories. We pay our respects to the people, the cultures and the elders past and present. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and I look forward to, over the next half an hour or so, walking you through our consultation regulation impact statement that relates to the Heavy Vehicle National Law. It's great to have you with us and great to have your engagement in this important work that we're doing. The purpose of the presentation, essentially, as I mentioned, is to introduce the consultation regulation impact statement to you, and encourage discussion of the options and hopefully encourage you to make submissions to the Commission about this particular consultation RIS. The responses that you make and others make will shape the recommendations that go to ministers and ultimately the shape of the Heavy Vehicle National Law. So the agenda for today is up on the screen there. I'm going to cover a little bit of background. In other words, how we got to where we are today. I'll then give you a bit of an overview of what's in the consultation RIS, scope and policy areas, bit of an overview, and then I'll cover in a little bit of detail the policy options and the consultation questions that are included in the RIS, and then wrap up with next steps, in other words, how you can make a submission, and also what's coming next. So in terms of the review itself, you can see there on your screen, you can see there on the screen that this review has been going for quite some time. Heavy Vehicle National Law has been in place since 2014 and was essentially a consolidation of heavy vehicle laws around the country. It was recognised at the time that there were some limitations in the law when it was produced, because it was essentially an amalgamation of a lot of different laws, and that there would be a review needed at some point in time. And subsequently, at the request of ministers, the NTC commenced a review and in 2020 released a consultation regulation impact statement. That's the predecessor, obviously, to this one. That particular regulation impact statement had a very broad remit and, to be honest, had a fairly mixed reaction from stakeholders. Subsequently, ministers in 2021 had a look at the situation of the reform and decided that it needed to be rather more focused and requested work on 6 specific work streams, and they were operator assurance, technology and data, duties and driver health, fatigue management, vehicles and access, and also the legislative approach. And after that direction from ministers, the NTC got busy. Ministers also appointed a gentleman, Mr. Ken Konofsky, to undertake a consultation process with stakeholders, and many of you may have been involved in that consultation process. And the intent of that consultation process was actually to come up with a package of reform options again, to further focus the reform and make sure that it delivered on the needs of governments, I guess, and their drive for safety and productivity, and also the needs of industry in terms of simplifying the law and making compliance easier, and of course also a safer and more productive industry. That package of policies was approved by ministers in August 2022 and had a broad level of support, and ministers then directed the NTC to focus on getting after those particular reforms. So the next step in the process was for the NTC to take that reform package and develop some of the foundational changes to the Heavy Vehicle National Law. And in pursuing that, it released a decision regulation impact statement. So that's an impact statement that went to ministers to make a decision, not just consult. And that was outlined a number of high-level changes to the law. And there were 14 recommendations in that decision RIS, and that's available on our website if anyone's interested in that. Ministers endorsed all 14 recommendations, and those recommendations were focused in 4 key areas. The regulatory framework, which was essentially, unsurprisingly, framing the law. So it talked about a tiered safety assurance environment. It talked about heavy vehicle obligations. It talked about alternative compliance, the future use of codes of practice and those sorts of things. It also addressed assurance and accreditation and proposed reform to the National Heavy Vehicle Accreditation Scheme for a range of reasons, including to maximise mutual alignment between accreditation schemes that affect the industry, but also to make the heavy, or address some of the issues with the NHVAS in the past and try and make it more safety focused. And one of the outcomes of that was to place a safety management scheme at the heart of the NHVAS. There was also recommendations around the creation of a technology and data framework, which was to essentially provide an authorising environment and also protections that relate to the use of technology in the heavy vehicle industry, and also data sharing, recognising that this was going to be a significant thing in the future. And finally, the decision RIS also addressed primary duties briefly. So the, as I mentioned before, the decision RIS was approved by ministers, or ministers endorsed all 14 recommendations, which provided a platform for the NTC to do further work. And that further work includes the consultation regulation impact statement that's currently out for consultation. This focuses on policy reform areas not considered in the decision RIS, but obviously really, really important to industry and others in making the law real and creating the platform for a modern future-focused law. The sorts of things in there were things like, and I'll touch on these again in a minute, but things like access and fatigue, some of the more sort of basic requirements of the Heavy Vehicle National Law in order to provide for a productive, efficient, and also safe industry. The purpose of the consultation regulation impact statement, as the name would suggest, is to set out what is proposed, set out a whole lot of possible options, background, etc., and seek feedback on those options. It includes obviously an analysis, and again, the purpose is to get feedback not only on the possible ways forward, but also if there are issues or deficiencies in the analysis or other things that need to be considered. We're interested in all of that. So the policy areas in the reform that I touched on just before, in the consultation RIS, really are fatigue management, access, and enhanced operator assurance. The latter getting a very light treatment because it was treated more so in the decision RIS, which has already been passed. But again, as I mentioned earlier, is available if you wish to read it on the NTC website. The fatigue management scope touches on the scope of fatigue regulated heavy vehicles, enforcement changes, which again, the intention there is to try and make sure that the law is more future focused and fairer, and also streamlining record keeping requirements, which we appreciate are always a bit of a rub for industry because it takes time and there are issues around the enforcement of that, and also ensuring that compliance is safety focused. Access, the key areas here are an increase in mass limits from the current general mass limits to concessional mass limits. In other words, moving mass limits up a little bit overall. Increasing overall length for general access, so going from 19 metres to 20 metres for a standard heavy vehicle, and increasing height or overall height for general access vehicles from the current 4.3 metres to 4.6 metres. And also, as I mentioned before, under enhanced operator assurance, just a little bit of information in there about the proposed national audit standard. So I'll cover these now in a little bit more detail for you, but in terms of the actual RIS itself, released on the 9th of October, consultation until the 24th of November. So a reasonable window, not short, but also not long. We are under a lot of time pressure to deliver this reform by the middle of next year. And so we need to keep that fairly tight. And we also wanted to keep the close of consultation clear of the Christmas period, when a lot of people are either going to be extremely busy or, for the lucky ones, not working too hard at all. As I mentioned, the scope is fatigue, mass and dimension limits, and the national audit standard. There's a total of 25 policy options, including the base case, throughout the RIS. There are 16 around fatigue management, and as I mentioned before, relating to record keeping, fatigue regulated heavy vehicles and enforcement. Access, there's 7 policy options and 2 around the national audit standard. Now, it's important to note that these are options. Some of them are mutually exclusive. Not all of them are, and I'll point to that as we go through the detail. But these aren't necessarily recommendations at this stage by the National Transport Commission. They are options to consider in trying to address the problems which are articulated in the regulation impact statement. There are also 25 consultation questions included in the document. That is to help people to frame responses. You don't have to answer those questions. You don't have to answer all of those questions or anything else to make a submission. They are there to assist you in making a submission and to assist us in interpreting the submissions as well. So it's to provide a bit of focus, but it's absolutely not mandatory. And if you wish to comment on other aspects of the RIS, go for your life. We're keen to get any feedback whatsoever. To support you in making or providing feedback or submissions, there is a summary document on our website. And this and other sessions will be conducted by the NTC to help inform stakeholders about the RIS and how it's framed, answer questions, etc., to make sure that we get the best possible number of submissions and feedback back, and also make sure that's the highest quality possible. One thing I will comment on at this point is that we have had a bit of a struggle with data to support some of the analysis in this consultation regulation impact statement. And you'll see in that document that we do call for people to come forward with any data or information that could help inform the analysis of the policy options. We're also proposing to conduct a targeted survey as well. And the point of doing all of this is that the consultation regulation impact statement is a step in the process. This is where we do consultation around a wide range of options. Where we go to next is a decision regulation impact statement, which is where the NTC makes recommendations to ministers, having consulted with you and others. Clearly, we want to make sure that the analysis that underpins that decision-making process is as good as it possibly can be. So again, just a bit of a call there that if you do have data that you're in possession of, or you might know where it is, that could assist us in doing the best possible analysis, please let us know. All right, we'll get into a little bit more of the detail in terms of the options or the policy options and the questions that are in the regulation impact statement. The first area, as I mentioned, is fatigue management, and the particular sub area is record keeping. And the intent here is to look at options for streamlining record keeping requirements for operators. The base case, which you'll normally find in regulation impact statements, is the current situation. So essentially, and that is always an option, is to make no change. That is to keep the current driver record keeping requirements. And when I refer to work diaries through here, because obviously that's one of the key record keeping requirements that are in the law at the moment, I also mean electronic work diaries as well. So not just written work diaries. The first option, or option 1A, so under record keeping, is to remove duplicate requirements from the law and streamline offences. So here the proposal is to just have a single offence for not completing a work diary correctly. So removing the multiple offences that currently exist in the law, so that's simplification. And leave the regulations to specify when and how to complete a work diary. So again, to move some of those requirements out of the primary law and move them down into regulations. That provides a lot more flexibility, and also by simplifying it, hopefully everyone will understand a lot better what those obligations are. So that's the first option. The second part of that, option 1B, is removing the administrative process requirements and offences. So in here, what we're talking about is the requirements of record keepers for when a work diary is lost, full or destroyed, are actually removed from the law. Clearly, the requirements for supplementary records need to be retained, but also allowing the regulator to specify the format of supplementary records, because currently there are some issues with supplementary records and the record keeping being very inconsistent. I should have mentioned in option 1A that in addition to removing the duplicate requirements, the intention there is also to split the requirements to the mandatory things, which will be retained in the law, but also move guidance and other things into, for example, the work diary, and making sure it's clear what is mandatory and what is just guidance, again, to try and minimise the issues that some people experience with administrative errors and getting caught out in that sort of a way. Also to consolidate information like driver's name, time zones and hours options, perhaps such that they only need to be recorded once rather than on every page in the work diary, and similarly removing some obligations that are in the law, like tallying hours, which is really not essential to the record keeping task, and making sure that there aren't offences that actually relate to that, and that if people want to fill that in, they can, but they don't have to. So again, really the focus here is streamlining those record keeping requirements. And I'm sure that'll be of interest to a lot of people who are out there driving long distance and currently have to complete these records. So the specific question there, obviously we're interested in what option or options people prefer here, but we also want to know about whether our assessment of the impacts of the options is correct, and whether there's anything else that we should be considering as we frame advice for ministers. The scope of fatigue regulated heavy vehicles, there's 6 policy options here that are contemplated in the RIS. The first, again, being a base case, which essentially means that it only applies to heavy vehicles greater than 12 tonnes, as it currently does, and that there's a work diary exemption for drivers doing local work. The options we're presenting are that the prescriptive fatigue requirements apply to heavy vehicles greater than 12 tonnes as they do at the moment, but also that drivers doing local work if you're greater than 12 tonnes would need to do the full work diary as well. So that's an increase in the record keeping obligation, or the scope of the record keeping obligations. Again, I do reiterate here that these are options and they all have advantages and disadvantages, and these are set out in the regulation impact statement. So they are options for consideration, they're not recommendations necessarily. Option 2B is basically to introduce a light work diary here for low risk operations, and this would include local work and potentially work where it is recognised to be lower risk and where perhaps normally a full written work diary would be required to be maintained, that a light work diary would be introduced and could be used. For example, for operations where they're essentially daytime, let's say for argument's sake, 6 a.m. till 8 p.m, and maybe not more work than 10 hours per day, not more work than 50 hours per week, for example. People could use a light work diary, so reduce the record keeping requirements for people who essentially fit into lower risk operations. So it's a tweak on the current record keeping arrangements. Option 2C. 2C is basically where all heavy vehicle drivers must do a work diary regardless, and all local work exemptions are removed. So this is where basically everybody has to keep a work diary, whether written or electronic. 2D is where all heavy vehicles are covered, so it doesn't matter the mass. So in other words, if you're a 5-ton vehicle, then you're caught by the requirement for the record keeping, but the local work exemptions are maintained. And option 2E is where all heavy vehicles are covered, but again, like what I described previously, where a light work diary requirement would apply for low risk operators. And that's the six options there for scope of fatigue regulated heavy vehicles. And the questions that we're asking in the regulation impact statement are on your screen now. So do you support one or more of the options? Very obvious question. And obviously we're after your reasons as well, not just what it is. So that's always very helpful for us to understand the why. That's really important to the analysis. Again, going back to the data problem that I mentioned earlier, do you have any information to support the analysis of these options? And the key parameter estimates that are in section 6.6.3 as well. Here we are interested in anecdotal evidence as well, because even that is more useful than having nothing at all. Are there any additional impacts that you think should be considered? So in proposing those options, we've looked at a whole lot of advantages and disadvantages of each of those. And clearly we've done that against particular impacts on particular parties with their drivers or operators or safety or whatever. But we want to know as well whether there's anything additional there. And the last question there just relates to buses as well. Because clearly, because this RIS does deal with heavy vehicles across the board, we're also interested in feedback in relation to buses specifically. So there is commentary in the RIS about the impact of the various options on buses. Although I'd have to say, in the main, that the specific impact on buses is not significant. Obviously, some of the impacts do affect buses, but they're not specific to buses. Okay, so the next area is enforcement, and this is one that certainly we've had a lot of feedback on as we've been consulting in developing the consultation RIS, so working with industry representatives and others in framing up these options and looking at the advantages and disadvantages, etc. And this really goes to the enforcement options in an effort to address minor work and rest and administrative offences. We know it's a rub for a lot of drivers and operators around what are considered by them often to be perhaps infringement notices or fines for relatively minor offending. So we're looking to look at options to try and address that and make sure the law stays focused on the safety outcomes, not necessarily on the just minor errors in record keeping or whatever. So again, base case is no change to the current arrangements. Option 3A is limiting the time frame for the issue of a work and rest breach infringement. So this is where we would set a time limit, and the RIS talks about either 14 or 28 days, after which an officer at the roadside cannot issue an infringement to a driver for a breach of work and rest hours. So it's essentially trying to say, well, look, if it's historical, whether historical is 14 days, 28 days, or something else, if it's historical, then you can't infringe it at the roadside. Again, the idea here is to stop what we hear a bit of, which is enforcement officers at the roadside going back through months and months and months of records, looking for something. So keeping it current. There's obviously pros and cons to doing that, but the intent there is, again, to make sure that it's focused on the shorter term, and hopefully as well stops the time taken at the roadside where an officer might choose to go back a long way in a work diary. I guess there are some sub-options within this one. So one option is to sort of say, well, look, if it's outside the time frame, then there's no enforcement action can be taken at all, but action may be able to be taken against other parties in the chain. There might be other alternate regulatory tools that can be applied, but not an infringement notice. So things like you could still prosecute if it goes further back, or potentially have a different penalty level. So if the offence is older, so beyond 14 days or 28 days, then the penalty amount is reduced, recognising that it's historical. So there are a few options there to consider in option 3A. Option 3B is the implementation of a risk profile for work and rest breaches, and there's an example in the RIS. But essentially, what this one does is it speaks to the idea of saying, well, look, okay, if you have a critical risk breach, well, fair enough, that is what it is, and there needs to be appropriate action taken. But maybe a single minor breach is an incident rather than an offence, and until you accumulate, let's say for argument's sake, 3 minor breaches over a period, it doesn't actually constitute an offence. So this is really, again, going to risk profile where safety issue, one minor is not such a problem. Option 3C speaks to a review of fines for trifling administrative offences. So I think that one stands for itself. If we go on to 3D, 3D is where a specific defence, and this one has been advocated to us, a specific defence is actually provided for minor administrative errors. So in this particular case, for example, if a driver could prove that the error or omission is in a work diary is low risk, it's not being used to manipulate work or rest time, it's not being used to falsify a record or create ambiguity, then there is a specific defence to say that that is not an offence. Option 3E is the supporting the use of formal warnings, so getting more robust framework around formal warnings inside the heavy vehicle national law, so that they are able to be used more effectively by enforcement officers, rather than enforcement officers being kind of almost forced into using infringements as the mechanism for taking some sort of an action. So it's providing a softer approach that needs to be backed up by systems, etc. We understand from enforcement officers there's already extensive use of warnings, but there isn't necessarily the systems in behind it to support it, which for some officers isn't suitable. And then the last one is perhaps a little bit more creative, which is allowing the option for formal education in lieu of a fine. So this is providing enforcement officers with the option of saying, okay, you've done the wrong thing here, but I think the best approach here is to require you to do some formal education, and that might be some online training produced by the NHVR, so accessed online. Bit of online learning, if you like, and for someone to have to complete that and record that they've completed that in lieu of receiving a fine. So that's about taking some action to make sure that that people are fully informed about the law, and that there's less likelihood of a breach in future. So somewhat more preventative in approach. This is used in other areas of the law. You hear about diversion programs and similar. The concept proposed is similar to that. And the consultation questions, I'm not going to read through all of those. You can see them there, and if you read the consultation regulation impact statement, you'll see them in there. But what we're interested in there, again, is the focused responses to the questions. And some of the questions speak to the sub-options, which I've mentioned in my presentation here, which, for example, if we're talking about option 3A, would a time frame of 14 days or 28 days be more appropriate? So that's the period beyond which the enforcement action is not possible or changed in some way, for example, a lesser penalty. And we're also interested in if the reforms were taken as a package, what that package might be, and would it create a fairer regulatory approach overall? So these particular options that I've just outlined, they're not mutually exclusive. You don't have to pick kind of one of six. In this particular case, a couple of them don't work too well together. For example, I mean, theoretically they do, but in practice they probably don't. For example, if you go to a risk-based approach to offences, it's very difficult to then combine that with a very limited time frame in which an enforcement officer could breach a driver for exceeding work time or not having enough rest time. They are probably mutually exclusive, but many of the others you could in fact implement multiple of the options. So we're interested in people thinking about this potentially as a package and what that package would look like among the 6 options. Well, if you exclude the base case, it's 5 options. Okay, moving on to access now. So change of pace from fatigue and record keeping, etc. These ones are rather simpler than the fatigue options in terms of what the proposals are and also what the options are, because the options, generally speaking, are we kind of do it or we don't do it. And in this particular case, the proposal is to increase mass limits from the current general mass limits up to concessional mass limits. There is some subtlety in that, but I'll come to that in a second. So the base case here is that there's no change. So we retain the current general mass limits. We also retain the current concessional mass limits with the requirement for accreditation. Now, the complicating factor here in the RIS is that we're in the process of implementing the Australian Design Rule 8004, which implements the Euro 6 emissions control standard. And what we're doing at the moment at the NTC is the policy work around providing a mass limit increase to provide for the additional emissions control equipment that's required for that ADR or Euro 6. And at this stage, there appears to be pretty strong consensus. Decisions not made, so it's pre-decisional, but there's pretty strong consensus around a half-tonne mass limit increase on the steer to provide for Euro 6. Because those decisions haven't been made yet, and we're concurrently looking at a change of mass limits from GML to CML, that there is an interplay between the two in terms of what the actual mass limit might look like. So I apologise, but this bit is somewhat complicated once you get into the detail. But conceptually, the base case is no change to mass limits other than potentially a provision for Euro 6. Assuming that gets approved by ministers. So option 4A then is increasing the mass limits to concessional mass limits, which broadly speaking is about a 5% mass limit increase, but there's no additional mass allowance provided for Euro 6. So the Euro 6 increase in mass is sort of absorbed into that increase up to CML. So CML becomes the new GML, if you like, with no provision for Euro 6. Option 4B is where you actually sum the two. So you take the change is GML to CML, and then you add the allowance for Euro 6 on top of that. You might get your 1 tonne increase on your triaxle, You might get a half a tonne on the drive axle for your rigid truck, for example. You get the half tonne which you would get by virtue of CML, and you potentially also get a small kick up on that as well, due to the Euro 6, depending on how the half tonne actually distributes between the steer axle and the driving axle of either the prime mover or the rigid truck. So again, it is a little bit complicated. I do apologise for that, but in its essence, the base case is no change as a result of this regulation impact statement, but may include a provision for Euro 6 option 4A, which is any change, which is an increase to CML, but any change due to Euro 6 is absorbed within that change. And option 4B is where it's GML to CML plus any provision for Euro 6. That's probably the easiest way to explain it. And they're the general questions that we're asking around that proposed mass limit increase. So where's the biggest benefit? How can we sort of simplify it? A big one here is for me anyway, at a policy level, is if we move from, let's say we don't choose the base case and we choose a case for change, is there any value in creating a new CML? So if you think about the current mass limits, there's 3 tiers. You've got general mass limits, concessional mass limits, and higher mass limits. If we move GML to CML, then there'll only be 2 tiers of mass limits, which will be the new GML and HML. The question there is, and there's no particular policy proposal around it, but the question is, should we be looking to create a new CML? So it's something between the new GML and HML, or is there really just not enough space and it's too complicated and not worth worrying about? So we're interested in your feedback on that as well. Okay. Now, the other area in access is around height and length increases. The height increase is pretty straightforward in that it's currently the height limit is 4.3 metres for general access vehicles. And I guess there's always pressure on that height limit. As we know, particularly with container vehicles and so on, with oversized containers and that sort of shipping containers and that sort of thing, there's often pressure on that height limit, and people have to use low profile equipment and so forth in order to transport those larger containers. And obviously height is also a constraint on volume for lighter freight, and there are some particular exemptions out there at the moment in various states and territories, and again I think they vary slightly around lighter freight or cubic freight. So what we're looking at here is saying, okay, given that there are already quite a lot of exemptions that exist for height to go to 4.6, should we just move the height limit to 4.6 for all general access vehicles, so make that the general access height limit, if you like, and move on? And there's obviously advantages and disadvantages to that. There are clearly constraints on the network, low bridges, low power lines, those sorts of things, which can be a bit of a problem for vehicles that are getting higher than 4.3 metres. But there are obviously also benefits in terms of providing, again, greater cubic capacity and more flexibility in terms of the use of equipment for certain loads if we do change that height limit. There are considerations like rollover stability, but again, as technology improves, there are also a lot of improvements to rollover stability as well, in terms of things like ESC and I guess prior to that ABS and those sorts of things as well. So they're the 2 options. It's basically a base case or a change to 4.6 metres. Length very similar. So the base case is that the length limit remains at 19 metres. So that's for your standard sort of truck and dog combinations or for your semi-trailer combination. The proposal here is to increase that to 20 metres, so lining it up a bit more with the limit that applies to performance-based standards at present. Again, similar considerations. There's more cubic capacity. but also there are potentially issues with swept path, rear overhang, and other issues as well. So again, we're looking for feedback on whether that's something that's supported and also of value. So looking at the questions then, essentially they get to what I've really just talked about, which is talking about the value to supply chains of making those particular changes, and do the benefits outweigh the risks and disbenefits. Again, whilst we are proposing consultation questions, we're not limiting you to responding to those questions, and you don't have to answer them all by any means. And if you want to make other comments, we're very, very keen to hear those, or have additional information, we're very keen to hear those as well. Okay. Yeah, so again, they're the remainder of the questions that are in the RIS that relate to length increase. This is an area, length and height actually are two areas of the RIS where we were struggling a bit to actually have really good data in terms of how to calculate the benefits and the costs as well. So we have done a quantitative analysis, which is trying to work out, do it by the numbers, but we've also done a qualitative analysis, which is more on advantages, offsetting advantages, disadvantages, to try and summarise where a particular option lands as well. So you'll find both analyses in the RIS, but we are a bit constrained with data because there's not a lot of really solid data that we've got that has enabled us to calculate precisely what we think the economic benefits and the economic costs would be to these particular changes. Thanks, Leo. So moving on to the third area that is addressed in the consultation RIS, this is the enhanced operator assurance. Most of this, as I mentioned before, was dealt with in the decision RIS back in when ministers dealt with that back in June. But the proposal here is just a couple of options around introducing a national audit standard, and essentially here whether it should be prescribed in primary law or regulations. That's really the option here, and I suppose that really speaks to how flexible we want to make the national audit standards. Because obviously it's a lot harder to change things that are in the primary law or legislation than it is to change things that are in regulations. They still need to go to ministers under the current arrangements, unless it's very, very minor. But in terms of the whole sort of process, it can take longer and be harder if it's got to go through Parliament. Again, that's covered there, and the question really is, do you agree with the potential impacts described for the national audit standard? And the intention of the national audit standard, largely for those who aren't actually tracking, the purpose of this is to facilitate mutual alignment of schemes, because as we know, there are a lot of schemes out and about which people are subject to, and these aren't just necessarily regulatory schemes, but they might be requirements placed on operators by third parties. For example, a consigner or a receiver, or someone who's contracting transport services requires a whole lot of auditing in order to assure themselves that their primary duty obligations are being managed, etc. What we're trying to do with the enhanced NHVAS, or enhanced operator assurance, and also the national audit standard, is to say, we're making these things more robust, and that you can be assured, if something meets a national audit standard, that it should be sufficient for your requirements, and hopefully that'll minimise duplication of auditing, because it's against a recognised international standard and those sorts of things. So this is an effort to try and streamline auditing and reduce the amount of auditing that currently occurs on operators, and also address that issue of third parties managing their primary duty obligations, the safety obligations particularly, by putting a safety management standard at the heart of NHVAS, which I mentioned earlier. Now, there's a couple of other questions here. These are actually earlier on in the RIS, but I've put them at the back end of the presentation because they don't speak particularly to the options, but they are things that we're still interested in. So these are higher level things. Has the case for change been appropriately articulated? Have we provided sufficient evidence to support government intervention? What other impediments are out there that perhaps we haven't identified and we might need to address in policy development? And are there any changes to the impact analysis methodology that we've used that people would suggest? Probably this is more an area where the associations and state governments and others are likely to comment on the regulation impact statement rather than perhaps drivers and operators and that sort of thing. However, we welcome comment from everybody. Everyone's absolutely entitled and encouraged to comment here. But these are really more sort of systemic comments that we're looking for. So, for example, on the last one, the impact analysis methodology. In some cases, we haven't been able to do a straight benefit cost analysis. In other words, we calculate the benefits to be X dollars and the costs to be Y dollars. What we've had to do is a different type of analysis, essentially a break-even analysis where we sort of work out, well, if you applied all of these costs, what would that of a particular thing, what would that mean in a more general sense rather than just strictly offsetting two numbers? It's a way to get at a decision or to enable a decision, but it's a bit different. And again, it's valid, it's just different. But we are interested in people's views about the way we've gone about it to make sure that it is satisfactory for decision-making by ministers. Okay, now in terms of next steps, I've mentioned a few times already, but submissions received by the closing date will be considered in preparing a decision RIS. Really important. And again, please don't be worried about the word submission. Some people sort of think, oh, submission, how do you do a submission? That's really complicated. It's really not complicated. A submission is anything. So, if you want to don't necessarily recommend it, but if you want to jot down some thoughts on the back of a beer coaster on a couple of the particular options, put that in an envelope and post that to us. That will be fine. Probably a little bit less useful than something that's a bit more comprehensive, but it's still acceptable. Again, if you want to address part of the RIS because it's an area you're particularly interested in, or you've got a particularly strong view about, or you've got good information about, by all means do that and ignore the rest of it. Again, the more we get from the more people, the better from our point of view. But we do need it by the closing date because we are on a pretty tight timeline. So when this closes, we'll be straight into preparing that decision regulation impact statement for ministers to consider early in 2024. And again, we recognise that our ability to talk to industry and governments for that matter over the Christmas period will be limited because, as I said before, people will either really be busy supporting the holiday period or they'll be off on holidays typically. Data and information, I've really banged on about that a lot. The better the analysis we can do, the better informed the decisions by ministers will be. So if you do have more information or better information than what we've used, or you want to challenge some of our assumptions and ideally propose an alternative, then that would be very, very welcome. Again, we've had to make some judgments around, for example, the time it takes to fill in a work diary on average. And again, they're in the document, but we're very happy to be challenged on those or have alternative points of view put, and we can rerun the analysis if that's appropriate. And I guess, I mentioned that we'll be looking for ministers to consider the decision RIS in early 2024. So there's not a lot of time for us to go from the end of this consultation through to finalising that for ministers to consider. The next stage then, after ministers have considered the policy options in the decision RIS and said, hey, NTC, these are the ones we want you to progress into legislation, is we'll be working, and we already are working really hard with Parliamentary Council to actually produce the draft legislation and core regulations, which we will be consulting with as well before that's finalised. But we are currently on a timeline to get that to ministers in July 2024. So again, not an enormous amount of time. All right, and the last slide there really just covers off how to make a submission. Ideally through our website. However, if you wish to post it to us, as I mentioned before, we're happy with that as well. And we will be running some public information sessions over the next few days. Anyone's welcome, although we will be using a very, very similar presentation to this one. So if unless you want to hear it a second time, then that might not be of a lot of value to you. Time's probably better spent actually having a look at the document and diving into some of the detail. Consultation closes on the 24th of November, as I mentioned, and submissions to that email address or via the website, as I say, they can be in whatever form, email, attachments, whatever works for you. And there's a couple of links in the presentation there as well, but it's very, very easy to find on our website to access the heavy vehicle reform page, and you'll see the documentation there, including a bit of the background to this reform, such as the decision RIS that went to ministers mid-year. And with that, I'll take a breath, have a glass of water, and hand back to Michelle. I'm happy to take any questions or however you want to get after this.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. We do have some questions. I'll start with the first one. Has there been any budget set aside for acquiring the data you're asking for on fair commercial terms, or are other organisations meant to subsidise the activity?
Look, I think, ideally, what we can get for nothing is obviously very welcome. But if people have data sets which are commercial data sets and would provide value in the context of the reform options that we're proposing, we'd be pleased to hear about it. We are talking to a couple of organisations about obtaining some information, and we understand that will cost us money. We don't have a huge budget, but if people are required to spend some time to do some work to get us information, then that is possible, yes.
Great. Another one, is it anticipated that Euro 6 will see an increase in only steer mass or steer and drive mass?
Yeah. So the current proposal there is, and it is a separate reform, but as I mentioned before, we've had to integrate it into the discussion on mass limits. But the current proposal is for a half-tonne allowance for the extra weight due to the emissions equipment, and it's also recognised that with Euro 6 vehicles also typically comes a lot of safety equipment that comes with a mass or tear mass penalty as well. So the proposal is half a tonne for a single steer, prime mover or truck, and that half a tonne, and again, this is part of the proposal, we're still working on it, but the policy proposal is to allow that half a tonne to float between the steer and the drive. So if you need 0.3, for example, 300 kilos on the steer, then you can have 200 kilos on the drive, and that recognises that bonneted prime movers, for example, and cab over prime movers, do distribute weight differently. So that's the current proposal.
Great. How does this October 2023 consultation RIS fit in with the June 2023 decision RIS and related non-legislative reform on access, such as an automated access system? How does the HVNL reform picture fit together?
Yep. So I've talked really largely about the legislative reform, which is the part of the program for which the NTC is responsible. So the decision RIS mid this year sort of set some of the higher level parameters around the law. And I mentioned heavy vehicle obligations. I mentioned alternative compliance and some of those sorts of things, framework for technology, so technology and data framework and stuff like that. The C-RIS, the one that you're looking at now, dives into some of the more detailed proposals in specific areas of reform, so mass limits and dimension limits, for example, and arrangements around fatigue management, so a bit more into the detail, most of it probably in the regulations rather than the primary legislation, not exclusively, but generally speaking. We're also getting after some non-risible reform elements. So in other words, they potentially have benefits, but not necessarily impacts on industry particularly. So there's some other pieces of work that we're doing, which we hope will also improve the law, and we're running that in parallel. Doesn't mean we won't consult, we will consult. We just don't need to put it through a formal regulation impact statement process, which has to be assessed by the Office of Impact Assessment and that sort of thing. So that's that stream of work. So that's all the legislation stuff. There's another whole stream of work which is being done by the jurisdictions and Austroads and others. For example, a national automated access system, which is a project that's on Austroads' books at the moment, and that is what it says on the label, is trying to come up with a much better way of managing access to the network in the sense of being much faster, clearer, etc. That's not something for the NTC, but there is a nexus there. So we've been talking to Austroads and others about, do you require any legislative changes, so changes to the Heavy Vehicle National Law to enable that system to operate when it's implemented? So, for example, enabling geospatial maps or that sort of thing in the law. So, yeah, we're connected with it, but it's not actually work that we're specifically doing. The two are running in parallel, but some of those things will also come after the Heavy Vehicle National Law reform, or the legislative reform piece, which I've been talking about, finishes. So trying to keep all that synchronised is certainly a challenge.
Right. How would the proposals to expand the scope of fatigue rules interact with the tiered safety assurance recommendation of the June 2023 decision RIS?
Yeah, so again, what the decision RIS does is sort of set up the framework around saying, okay, there'll be this sort of arrangement that relates to operator assurance, or if you want to think about it more specifically, a future or enhanced NHVAS. What the decision RIS was sort of opened up the opportunity in that new framework for the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator to sort of be much more flexible, perhaps, in creating alternative compliance options. So where at the moment it tends to be fairly limited to, you either work to the general schedule or the standard hours, you work to BFM or you work to AFM. What the new framework allows is for the NHVR to be a bit more tailored in terms of alternative compliance regimes that it can create. So it might create something that sits kind of between BFM and AFM, or potentially between standard hours and BFM, etc. And that might be industry specific or whatever. So the decision RIS enables that broadly and provides the NHVR at a policy level, and we need to build that into the legislation. We're working on that now. It allows the NHVR to do those sorts of things, which are much more flexible. The C-RIS that we're talking about now gets a lot more into the kind of nuts and bolts of things like record keeping and those sorts of things, which would sit down in the regulations or potentially even push some things out of regulations. So it deals in that kind of space. There are still discussions about how exactly we frame the outer limits, for example, for fatigue. So the discretion that's allowed for the regulator. Again, some of that's dealt with in the decision RIS. Some of it's dealt with at a policy level, but we also now need to sort of make that more specific. And there's a good example in the C-RIS of how fatigue and alternative compliance would actually work in practice. If you look at one of the appendices, I can't remember which one it is, but you'll find some information there that hopefully be quite useful to explain that.
Great. I have one more. Isn't the content of the C-RIS the sort of flexibility that should have been handed to the regulator?
I think the The proposal generally through this whole reform is to give the regulator more ability to regulate. No question about that. That's one of the sort of principles, if you like, that we're trying to achieve through this. There is, though, a need for ministers to still control the policy settings, recognising that ministers ultimately have a responsibility for road safety outcomes, etc., and they'll invest on taxpayers' behalf into road safety and that kind of thing. So there is a balance there between the discretion or what's specified in the law and the regulations and what is given as discretion to the NHVR. And that's been one of the challenges with this reform, is to sort of try and get that balance right. And hopefully we'll get there. And in terms of this particular RIS, if you look at some of the fatigue options, it's actually giving a little bit more flexibility to the regulator if some of the options are chosen. Obviously, if other options are chosen, that's not so much. Similarly, it provides a bit more flexibility in terms of, again, the very prescriptive nature of some of the administrative offences, etc., that currently exist. It tries to sort of open that up a little bit more. But of course, as soon as you sort of do that, there's also the counter, which is potentially for people who are trying to do the wrong thing, you open it up a bit to them as well. And again, we're just trying to hit that right balance. And we're very keen to get feedback on all of that. That's really important in this stage.
Great. Thank you, John. That's the end of our session. Thank you for presenting. If you have any questions, please send an email to info@natroad.com.au and we can pass it on, or Don's email address. The details were on the screen as well. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you, everyone.